I signed the document that stripped me of everything I owned, and I smiled as if I had just been given a gift. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne, the kind Daniel had started wearing a few months ago, back when I still believed his distance was just stress and not something far more deliberate. Across the table, my husband of 42 years sat with his hands folded neatly, his expression calm, almost relieved, while beside him Chloe, my daughter-in-law, shifted slightly in her chair, her lips curved into that soft, practiced smile she used whenever she thought she had already won. The lawyer, Mr. Carter, cleared his throat and slid the final page toward me, tapping the signature line with a pen that probably cost more than my first paycheck. Mrs. Hayes, once you sign here, this agreement becomes legally binding. His voice was polite, detached, as if he were discussing a routine transaction instead of the quiet dismantling of a life I had spent decades building. I glanced down at the paper, at the neat rows of legal language that declared I would walk away with nothing. No house, no savings, no claim to the business Daniel and I had built together from a cramped one-bedroom apartment and a second-hand desk. For a brief moment, I let my eyes linger on the words, not because I didn't understand them, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt to be underestimated. I picked up the pen slowly, aware of Chloe watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction, tears, anger, anything that would confirm the version of me she had already decided existed. But I gave her nothing. I signed my name with steady hands, the same careful handwriting I had used to sign birthday cards, school forms, and mortgage papers for years. When I finished, I placed the pen down gently and looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time that morning. He searched my face, perhaps expecting hesitation, regret, maybe even a last-minute plea. Instead, I smiled. Not warmly, not bitterly, just enough to make him believe I had accepted my place in the story they had written for me. Chloe exhaled softly, a flicker of satisfaction passing across her features before she quickly masked it. She reached for Daniel's hand under the table, a small gesture she probably thought I wouldn't notice. But I noticed everything now. I noticed the way Daniel leaned slightly toward her, the way his shoulders seemed lighter, as if shedding me had freed him from some invisible weight. I noticed the confidence in the room, the quiet certainty that I was leaving with nothing while they walked away with everything. And I let them believe it. Because what they didn't understand, what they had never bothered to understand, was that silence is not the same as surrender. As Mr. Carter gathered the documents and began explaining the next steps, his words faded into the background, blending into a low hum that filled the room but meant nothing to me. I sat there, composed, listening just enough to nod at the appropriate moments, playing my role until the very end. Outside, through the tall glass windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, stretching everything into distorted shapes. It reminded me of how easily appearances could be manipulated, how something solid could be made to look fragile, and something fragile could be made to look strong. Daniel stood first, buttoning his jacket, already shifting his attention toward the future he believed he had secured. Chloe followed, smoothing her dress, her expression polished and serene. They didn't look back as they moved toward the door. They didn't need to. In their minds, this was over. In their minds, I had lost. I remained seated for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly on the table, feeling the quiet settle around me. Then I stood, adjusted my coat, and walked out of the room without a word. Because the truth was, by the time I signed that document, everything that mattered had already been decided, and not in the way they thought. 72 hours earlier, the house was quiet in a way that did not feel peaceful but hollow, as if something essential had already been removed and only the shape of a home remained behind. I stood in the kitchen at exactly 6:30 in the morning, pouring coffee into Daniel's favorite mug, the white ceramic one with a thin crack along the handle that I had asked him to replace years ago but never did. The machine clicked softly as it finished brewing, filling the room with a familiar scent that used to mean comfort and routine, but now felt like a memory I was replaying out, of habit rather than belief. I set his cup on the table in the exact spot where he always sat, then placed mine across from it, aligning the handles the way I always had, a small detail that once made me feel like everything in our life was in order. Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later, already dressed, his tie perfectly straight, his expression distant. He did not look at me right away. Instead, he checked his phone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen as if something on it mattered more than the woman who had shared his life for over 4 decades. "You are up early," I said, keeping my voice even, almost casual. He nodded without meeting my eyes. "Busy day," he replied, taking a sip of coffee and setting the mug down after barely tasting it. He used to linger at the table talking about plans, about work, about nothing in particular just to fill the space between us. Now he stood after less than a minute, adjusting his jacket as if the kitchen itself made him uncomfortable. "I might be late tonight," he added, already halfway toward the door. I watched him leave without asking any questions. I had learned that questions no longer brought answers, only polite deflections or silence. The front door closed with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have, and for a moment I remained standing there, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair across from me. The house felt larger than it had the day before, as if the walls had shifted outward overnight, creating more distance between everything that used to feel close. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, and looked around the room I had kept running for so many years. Every surface was clean, every detail in place, every sign of care still visible, but something underneath it all had changed. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the living room, folding a blanket that did not need folding, straightening a stack of magazines that were already aligned. Small, unnecessary movements that gave my hands something to do, while my mind quietly assembled pieces I had ignored for too long. Chloe's laughter had echoed through this house more frequently in recent months, always light, always effortless, always just a little too familiar. Daniel's schedule had shifted around her visits in ways that once seemed coincidental, but now felt intentional. I paused near the window, watching the driveway where his car would eventually return, and for the first time, I allowed myself to stop explaining it away. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was clarity, sharp and steady, settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle I had been unwilling to complete. I set the blanket down carefully and smoothed it once more, even though it did not need it, then turned off the light and walked out of the room. Some realizations do not arrive with noise or chaos. They arrive quietly, in ordinary moments, and once they do, everything that follows becomes a choice. That evening the phone rang at exactly 7:12, a time so specific it stayed with me long after the call ended, as if the moment itself had been marked for something I had not yet fully understood. I was in the kitchen again, rinsing a plate that did not need rinsing, the sound of running water filling the silence Daniel had left behind earlier that morning. I dried my hands slowly before answering, not out of hesitation but out of instinct, the same instinct that had been quietly guiding me for days. "Margaret, it is Helen," the voice said, careful and measured, as if each word had been chosen in advance. Helen Brooks had been my neighbor for over 20 years, a woman who noticed everything but rarely spoke unless she believed it mattered. I leaned lightly against the counter, holding the phone close. "Hello, Helen," I replied, my tone steady. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that carries more meaning than words. "I am not sure how to say this," she continued, lowering her voice slightly, "and I would not say anything at all if I did not think you deserve to know." I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of fear but recognition. This was the moment the quiet clarity I had been feeling would finally take shape. "Just tell me," I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "I saw Daniel yesterday afternoon," she said, "at that cafe on Elm Street. He was not alone." I did not speak, giving her the space to finish. "He was with Chloe," she added gently. They were sitting very close. It did not look like a casual meeting. The water in the sink continued to run behind me, a soft, steady sound that made everything else feel distant, almost muted. "Are you sure it was them?" I asked, not because I doubted her, but because the question needed to be asked. "I am sure," Helen said, her voice firm now. "I would not have called if I was not." I thanked her quietly, keeping my tone unchanged, and after a few more careful words, we ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter and reached over to turn off the faucet, the sudden silence settling heavily in the room. For a long moment, I stood there, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the sink, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply allowed the truth to exist without trying to reshape it into something easier to accept. Images began to arrange themselves in my mind, not as scattered suspicions, but as a clear sequence. Chloe's frequent visits when Ethan was out of town. Daniel's sudden interest in staying late at the office. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room, followed by polite smiles that felt just slightly delayed. None of it had seemed urgent at the time. Now it felt intentional. I walked into the living room and sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window where the late evening light filtered in softly across the carpet. The house was quiet again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt precise, like everything was exactly where it needed to be for me to finally see it clearly. I folded my hands in my lap and looked out toward the driveway, where the faint outline of headlights would eventually appear. "I see," I said quietly to no one in particular, the words barely more than a breath. Not a question, not a reaction, just an acknowledgement. Because once the truth is spoken, even gently, it cannot return to silence, and from that moment forward, every decision becomes deliberate. The next morning I woke up at exactly 5:45, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved ahead of everything I used to rely on. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes just before the day begins, when even the smallest sound feels intentional. I made my bed with the same careful movements I had practiced for years, smoothing the sheets, aligning the pillows, creating the appearance of order even though I knew that order had already been broken in ways that could not be seen. I dressed simply, choosing a navy blue coat and low heels, the kind of outfit that did not draw attention but carried quiet authority. In the mirror, I studied my reflection for a moment, not searching for reassurance, but confirming something I had not acknowledged before. I was not the woman they thought I was. By 7:15, I was in my car, the engine humming softly as I pulled out of the driveway without leaving a note, without informing Daniel of where I was going. For the first time in years, my movements belonged entirely to me. The office building stood on the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, a place I had passed countless times without ever needing to enter. The glass doors reflected the early morning light as I stepped inside, the cool air greeting me with a sense of neutrality that felt almost welcome. At the front desk, I gave my name calmly. Margaret Hayes. "I have an appointment with Mr. Bennett." The receptionist nodded and asked me to take a seat, her tone polite, her attention already shifting to the next task. I sat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, observing the room without appearing to do so. People moved in and out, briefcases in hand, conversations low and efficient, everything functioning with quiet precision. When Mr. Bennett appeared, he was exactly as I had expected. Mid-50s, composed, attentive in a way that suggested he listened more than he spoke. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, extending his hand. I accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Inside his office, I took the chair across from his desk and placed my handbag carefully beside me. There was no need for hesitation now. "I need to review every asset connected to my name," I said, my voice even measured. "Properties, accounts, business holdings. Everything." He studied me for a moment, not with curiosity, but with professional awareness. "Of course," he replied.
May.
I ask if this is related to a pending separation. I met his gaze, without blinking. "It is related to ensuring that what belongs to me remains mine." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just acknowledging the clarity of what had been said. He nodded once and began outlining the process, the documents we would need, the timelines involved, the legal pathways that could be taken without drawing unnecessary attention. I listened carefully, committing each detail to memory, asking questions only when necessary, each one precise, each one intentional. By the time the meeting ended, a quiet structure had already begun to form, not visible to anyone outside that room, but solid enough to hold everything that would come next. As I stood to leave, Mr. Bennet handed me a folder, its contents neatly organized, its weight light but significant. "We will proceed carefully," he said. I inclined my head slightly. That is exactly what I expect. When I stepped back outside, the sun had fully risen, casting a clean, steady light across the street. I paused for a brief moment before walking toward my car, not to reflect, but to mark the shift that had already taken place. Because from that morning forward, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next, and more importantly, who would be left standing when it was over. Over the next 2 days, nothing in the house changed on the surface, and that was exactly how I needed it to be. I continued my routines with quiet precision, preparing meals, answering calls, maintaining the rhythm of a life that appeared untouched, even as everything beneath it shifted into place. Daniel returned home late that evening, just as he had said he would, his movements practiced, his tone neutral as he placed his keys on the counter and loosened his tie. "Long day," he said, not expecting a response so much as offering a placeholder for conversation. I nodded slightly from where I stood at the stove, stirring a pot that no longer required stirring. "Dinner is ready," I replied. We sat across from each other in the dining room, the same table, the same chairs, the same quiet that had once felt comfortable and now felt curated. He spoke about work in broad terms, nothing specific, nothing that required follow-up. I listened, not because I was interested, but because I was observing. Every word, every pause, every glance that did not quite meet mine confirmed what I already knew. Later that night, after he had gone upstairs, I remained in the kitchen, wiping down the already clean counter, aligning objects that were already in place. Then, with steady hands, I reached for my phone and sent a brief message to Mr. Bennet. "Proceed." The reply came within minutes. "Understood. We will begin tomorrow morning." The following day, I moved through a series of quiet appointments that left no visible trace. A visit to the bank, where I sat across from a young manager who addressed me with polite efficiency, unaware of the significance behind the documents I signed. Accounts were reviewed, access was adjusted, authority was clarified in language that left no room for interpretation. From there, I drove to a small office on the edge of town, one that handled property records, where signatures were placed and filings were initiated with the same calm certainty I had carried since the moment everything became clear. Each step was simple on its own, almost ordinary, but together they formed something far more substantial. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the house looked exactly as it had when I left it, sunlight falling across the living room floor, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, nothing out of place. Chloe arrived shortly after 5, her presence announced by the soft click of her heels against the entryway floor. "Margaret," she called out brightly, stepping into the kitchen as if she belonged there. I turned to face her, offering a small, measured smile. "Chloe," I replied. She moved through the room with ease, opening the refrigerator without asking, pouring herself a glass of water, her movements confident, unguarded. "Daniel said you have a meeting coming up," she said casually, her tone light but her eyes attentive. "Everything all right?" I held her gaze for just a moment longer than usual, then nodded. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said. She smiled back, satisfied with an answer she believed she understood. We stood there for a few seconds in silence, the space between us filled with things neither of us would say. Then she set her glass down and turned toward the hallway, her footsteps fading as she moved deeper into the house. I watched her go, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper with every passing hour. Because while they moved through my home believing they were in control, everything that mattered had already begun to move beyond their reach, piece by piece, decision by decision, all without a single raised voice or a single broken routine. The morning of the meeting arrived without urgency, which was exactly how I wanted it. I woke at 6, the same time I had for years, and moved through the house with the same measured routine, as if nothing significant was waiting at the end of the day. I made coffee, set the table, and chose a simple gray suit that carried no statement beyond quiet composure. In the mirror, my reflection looked unchanged, and that, too, was intentional. By 9:30, I was seated in the conference room once again, the same polished table, the same controlled atmosphere, everything arranged to suggest order and finality. Daniel arrived first, his posture confident, his expression composed in a way that felt rehearsed. Chloe followed moments later, her presence smooth and assured, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on me. "Good morning," she said lightly, as if we were gathering for something routine, something harmless. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement. "Good morning." Mr. Carter entered shortly after, carrying a folder that appeared identical to the one from before, though I knew appearances often concealed more than they revealed. He greeted us professionally and took his seat, placing the documents neatly on the table. "We will proceed with final confirmations," he said, his tone steady. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm resting along the edge, his confidence evident in the way he did not rush, did not question. Chloe sat beside him, her hands folded, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she were watching the final moments of a process she had already calculated. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in front of me, my focus not on the outcome they expected, but on the timing of everything that would follow. Mr. Carter reviewed the terms, his voice even, outlining what had already been agreed upon, reinforcing the narrative that I would leave with nothing while Daniel retained full control. I listened without interruption, nodding once at the appropriate moment, allowing the room to settle into its assumptions. When the final page was placed before me, the same familiar line waiting for my signature, I picked up the pen without hesitation. I could feel their attention shift, subtle but unmistakable, the quiet anticipation of completion. I signed my name again, the motion smooth, deliberate, final in appearance but not in truth. As I placed the pen down, I looked up, letting my gaze move briefly between Daniel and Chloe. There was satisfaction there, contained but visible, the kind that comes when people believe their efforts have succeeded without resistance. Mr. Carter gathered the documents and closed the folder, offering a small nod. "This concludes the agreement," he said. Daniel exhaled softly, a release of tension he likely did not realize he had been holding. Chloe allowed herself a faint smile, her shoulders easing slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. I stood at the same time they did, adjusting my coat, my movements unhurried, my expression unchanged. No one questioned the calm. No one looked beyond it. As we moved toward the door, Daniel spoke, his tone almost courteous. "This is for the best," he said, as if repeating something he had told himself many times before. I paused for just a fraction of a second, then nodded once. "Of course," I replied. Outside the room, the hallway stretched ahead, quiet and orderly, leading toward an exit that felt more symbolic than physical. They walked slightly ahead of me, their steps light, their conversation low, already shifting toward what they believed would come next. I followed at a measured pace, neither behind nor beside them, simply present. Because while they stepped forward believing everything had just been secured, the truth had already moved beyond this room, beyond these papers, beyond anything they could see, waiting patiently for the moment it would reveal itself in full. By the time we stepped outside the building, the air felt sharper, cooler, as if the world itself had shifted slightly while they were inside celebrating a victory that no longer existed. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his car keys, his movements relaxed, almost casual, while Chloe stood beside him, her posture light, her expression carrying that same quiet confidence she had worn all morning. "We should go by the house later," she said, her tone smooth, already planning, already settling into a future she believed was secured. "There are a few things I want to start organizing." Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he replied, glancing briefly at her before looking toward the parking lot. "We have time." I stood a few feet away, adjusting the sleeve of my coat, giving them the space they assumed they owned, allowing their conversation to unfold without interruption. "Actually," I said calmly, my voice steady enough to cut cleanly through their exchange without raising itself, "there is something you should know before you make any plans." They both turned toward me, the shift in their attention immediate but subtle, as if they expected a minor detail, a last question, something insignificant. I held their gaze evenly. The house is no longer in Daniel's name. I continued. The silence that followed was brief but distinct, like a pause in music before the note changes. Daniel frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the early stages of disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone controlled, though the certainty in it had already begun to thin. Chloe's expression did not change right away, but her eyes sharpened, focusing more carefully now. I reached into my handbag and removed a folder. The same one Mr. Bennett had handed me, its edges crisp, its contents already finalized. "The property was transferred 2 days ago," I said, handing the document forward just enough for them to see, not close enough for them to take, along with every associated account tied to it. Daniel's hand hovered in the air for a moment before lowering slowly, as if the action itself no longer made sense. "That is not possible," he said, quieter now, the confidence slipping from his voice in increments rather than all at once. Chloe stepped slightly closer, her attention fixed on the paper, her composure tightening at the edges. "You signed everything today," she said, her tone measured, but no longer relaxed. I inclined my head slightly. "Yes," I replied. "I signed exactly what was placed in front of me." Another pause, longer this time, stretching just enough to allow the truth to settle into the space between us. "What you did not understand," I continued, "is that what you were given to review was already incomplete." Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the first real fracture in his certainty. "Incomplete how?" he asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. "The assets you believed were part of that agreement had already been removed from it," I said. "Legally, properly, and without requiring your consent." Chloe's posture changed then, a subtle step back, her shoulders drawing in slightly as the structure she had been relying on began to unravel. "That does not make sense," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than before. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch my expression. "It does," I said quietly. "You just were not paying attention to the right things." The street around us continued as normal, cars passing, people moving, the world unchanged, while within that small space, everything they had built their expectations on shifted beyond recovery. I closed the folder and returned it to my bag, the motion calm, final. "You should review your position," I added, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. Then I turned and walked toward my car, leaving them standing where they were, not broken, not destroyed, but suddenly aware that the outcome they had been certain of no longer belonged to them, and perhaps never had. I did not look back as I got into my car, not because I was trying to prove something, but because there was nothing left behind that required my attention. The engine started with a quiet hum, steady and reliable, a sound that felt more certain than anything that had existed inside that house for a long time. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught a brief glimpse of them in the rearview mirror, still standing where I had left them, their posture no longer aligned, their certainty no longer intact. Then they disappeared from view, just another detail fading into the past. The drive home was uneventful, the same streets, the same traffic lights, the same familiar turns, yet everything felt different in a way that did not need to be explained. When I arrived, the house stood exactly as it always had, the exterior unchanged, the windows reflecting the late afternoon light. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the quiet settling around me once again, but this time it did not feel hollow. It felt complete. I moved through each room slowly, not searching for anything, simply acknowledging what remained. The living room where I had spent years maintaining an image of harmony. The kitchen, where routines had been preserved long after their meaning had shifted. The bedroom, where silence had replaced conversation. I paused in the center of the house, taking in the stillness, understanding that this space no longer held the same weight it once did. Later that evening, my phone rang. I did not need to check the screen to know who it was. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice calm when I spoke. "Yes." Daniel's voice came through, controlled but strained in a way he could not fully conceal.
"We need to talk," he said.
I walked toward the window, looking out at the street as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. "There is nothing left to discuss," I replied. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a quieter question. "Where are we supposed to go?" I considered the words, not the tone behind them, just the question itself. "That is something you should have thought about earlier," I said, not unkindly, just clearly. Chloe's voice appeared faintly in the background, her words indistinct but urgent, her composure no longer as seamless as it had been before. Daniel spoke again, but I did not wait for the sentence to finish. I ended the call and placed the phone down without hesitation. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, steady and predictable, marking the transition from day to night without drama. I turned away from the window and walked back through the house, my steps unhurried, my movements no longer tied to anyone else's expectations. There were no raised voices, no final confrontations, no need for explanations that would only echo into silence. Everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed, not through conflict, but through consequence. I reached the front door once more, opened it, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky stretched wide above, clear and uninterrupted, the kind of space that reminds you how small certain things become once you stop holding on to them. I closed the door behind me gently and walked forward, not looking back, not because I was leaving something unfinished, but because for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left behind that still belonged to me.